On my 29th birthday, my parents walked into my apartment without knocking and dropped a folder on my table like it was the bill for my existence. My father let out a soft, satisfied laugh that filled the room like smoke. My mother tapped the folder and announced that my sister's future was finally secured, never noticing the candle burning out behind them. I didn't argue or ask why they brought it. I simply stood there wondering how long it would take them to realize what they took wasn't mine to lose. Silence felt safer than speaking, the only shield I'd ever learned to use. Growing up, our house always sounded like it belonged to someone else. Grace's piano lessons echoed proudly through the hallways while my parents cheered like an audience at her private concert. I learned to move quietly in the background, careful not to disturb the soundtrack of their expectations. Money was the first thing they took without asking. I was 17 when my father borrowed my part-time savings with a casual jingle of his keys. That same week, Grace walked into the house wearing a brand new dress, and the math explained itself. By 20, I learned to shrink my achievements before anyone else did. When I earned my first data security certification, my father glanced at it and asked if I could reset his passwords instead. My mother shifted the conversation back to Grace's internship as if my milestone was an intermission. So I worked quietly, building a future no one else cared to notice. Every extra hour at the office and every weekend freelance job went straight into my savings account. Numbers became my diary, the only place where my progress was recorded. My studio apartment wasn't pretty, but it was mine. Thin walls, a rattling heater, and a window I had to tape shut couldn't dull the pride I felt transferring money each month. Watching the balance rise felt like filling a cracked glass slow, uneven, but entirely my own. Still, my family always found ways to remind me where I stood. Grace's graduation celebration lasted a week, while mine ended before the cake softened. When I earned a promotion, my father handed me a list of bills he needed covered just this month. 6 years ago was the moment that finally broke something inside me. I had completed a career-defining project and walked into my parents' living room hoping someone would care. Instead, they were already deep in conversation about Grace's newest idea, barely noticing me. And now on my 29th birthday, history repeated itself in my own apartment. My father slid the worn folder across my table like a contract I'd pre-approved. My mother wandered around, inspecting the place like a hotel suite she didn't plan to stay in. I opened the folder slowly because stillness was the only thing that kept me grounded. Their expectations pressed on me like a silent demand hanging in the air. In that moment, I realized I was no longer the person willing to be used without question. The first page was a withdrawal confirmation, simple and brutal. The number at the bottom didn't make sense until my brain finally accepted what it meant. 10 years of extra shifts, skipped holidays, and careful planning had vanished with one signature $2,900,000 gone. My father tapped the page and thanked me, as if he were congratulating himself for winning a game. My mother adjusted her sleeve and calmly said I would have wasted the money anyway. The fridge hummed louder than the people who had just emptied my life's work. Something inside me paused, not a feeling or a thought, just a full stop. I finally saw the truth without excuses or softness. Grace wasn't in the room, but every word they spoke carried her name. My hand hovered above the folder like it was reaching for something that no longer belonged to me. I lowered it slowly, the way someone sets down an object that isn't theirs anymore. They kept talking about plans and renovations, as if I were nothing more than air absorbing their voices. I didn't argue or ask why because those instincts had been trained out of me years ago. Silence became the clearest answer I could give. It sat between us, heavy and intentional. Then I did the one thing they never expected. I laughed. It wasn't loud or bitter. It was a quiet release shaped into a sound they mistook for surrender. But in reality, it was the moment I stopped pretending they'd ever seen me. I laughed because the money they took wasn't my real savings. The account they drained had been theirs to find all along. They believed they understood me, practical, quiet, predictable, but they never understood how I prepared. 3 years earlier, I created a mirrored account with deposits that matched my real patterns. Every amount was chosen to look authentic, every transfer placed with intention. It existed for one purpose, only to be touched by the wrong hands. The morning after my birthday, my apartment felt painfully still. The folder sat exactly where my father had pushed it, its corner bent under the weight of their assumptions. I made coffee, steadied myself, and opened my laptop. My logs were organized with timestamps, notes, and color-coded markers for expected behavior. I had mapped out precisely when a suspicious withdrawal would trigger a fraud alert. The system I helped design was already doing its quiet work. My real savings lived somewhere else, untouched and invisible. The audit trail ID built showed a perfect replica with no personal expenses linking it to me. It was suspiciously clean, exactly the trap it was meant to be. My parents thought they had taken a decade of my life, not knowing I had engineered the account for this moment. I sent a single text to my lawyer. They accessed the flagged account. Moments later, he replied with one word we'd rehearsed months earlier: proceed. No arguments, no explanations, just the documentation we'd prepared for years. I opened another folder quietly stored in my records. Inside were statements, transfers, emails, and every piece of proof needed to let the truth stand on its own. Everything I had ever saved for myself was laid out in clean, precise rows. I added the final screenshot, the decoy account sitting at 0. For a moment, the blinking cursor looked like a tiny heartbeat in an empty cell. I exhaled slowly and closed the window. The next step was surprisingly simple. I opened my banking app and removed my parents from every automatic payment they'd convinced me to cover over the years. I had maintained those payments out of habit, not devotion. One by one, I canceled insurance, utilities, and the monthly family emergency contribution. Each soft click felt like the quietest boundary I had ever drawn. Then I opened my notebook and wrote a list, not of what they owed me, but what I no longer owed them. It was shorter than I expected, painfully short. I crossed the final line with one clean stroke. At work, the office lights hummed their steady fluorescent white. Noah passed my desk balancing lunch and a stack of reports, giving me a nod that seemed to read something new in my posture. I returned the nod, nothing more, letting the moment pass. I spent the rest of the day reviewing an upcoming contract, double-checking encryption flows and access protocols. My focus felt sharper than usual, almost unnaturally precise. When the office finally quieted, I opened a private folder of strategies I'd once hidden from my parents' dismissive comments. I reread every idea, not with longing but with clarity. For once, the pages felt like possibility instead of permission. When I closed the folder, the decision inside me felt settled and unmoving. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my dining table. The folder my parents brought still sat nearby, untouched. Instead, I opened my real savings account and stared at the balance, steady, untouched, undeniably mine. The numbers settled into my chest like an anchor. I sipped my wine and reviewed my documents again, the alerts, the audit logs, the exact inconsistencies their withdrawals would trigger. Everything was unfolding exactly as it was designed to. There was no rage left in me, just a stillness carved from years of being underestimated. My parents had taught me the weight of silence. I had simply learned how to use it with intention. I closed my folder gently, leaving no sound behind. Yesterday's birthday candle sat bent on the counter like a small, tired memory. I picked it up, examined it, and set it back down, this time refusing to fix what they had damaged. The first alert came with my morning coffee, the phone vibrating softly on the counter. A notification from the bank flashed, unusual activity detected. I stared at it while the steam brushed warm against my face. Then my phone rang, my father's number lighting up the screen. His voice burst out before I could speak, demanding to know what I had done. The bank had frozen every account and opened an investigation on their withdrawals. I leaned against the counter and answered calmly. I told him I'd received an alert too, something about a fraud review. He barked back that the bank suspected money laundering and was questioning their transfer patterns. Patterns, the exact thing the trap had been built around. Before I could speak, my mother's frantic voice bled through, begging me to fix everything. She said their reputation was at stake, that Grace was crying and my father couldn't breathe. I raised my cup to my lips and asked, "You mean the future my money supposedly secured?" Silence filled the line like a door finally shutting. I ended the call and opened my email. Another alert appeared, this time from a federal compliance office. The flagged account was under full review, and it wasn't mine. A moment later, my lawyer's message arrived with only one confirmation: they triggered the full audit. Stand by. Everything moved in clean, predictable lines after that, like dominoes falling exactly where they'd been placed years ago. By midday, my parents had called 8 times and Grace twice. I ignored every call. Instead, I focused on a contract draft at my desk, redlining sections that needed clarity. My pen stayed steady, my heartbeat calm. That evening, the news ran a short segment about a local couple under investigation for financial misconduct. The camera caught my parents outside their home in full panic. Their arrogance from my apartment was gone, replaced with frantic fear. The next morning, the escalation arrived. A hard, desperate knock rattled my apartment door, and my mother stumbled in with panic clinging to her like perfume. Her hair was unbrushed, her voice trembling. She paced my living room like a trapped animal, begging me to listen. Investigators had questioned them about wire transfers and missing statements. My father almost fainted, she said, as if his reaction changed the facts. When I told her not to touch what wasn't hers, she froze. She insisted everything they'd done was for the family, but we both knew she meant Grace. Then she accused me of setting them up, too blind to see they had set the trap for themselves. The day after the final shift arrived, emails, letters, and a formal audit notice all confirmed what I already knew. My lawyer's message sealed it. They had accessed the flagged account. I stepped onto my balcony, letting the warm air press softly against my face. The city hummed below with its usual indifference. Inside, the TV replayed the news, my parents' voices barely reaching me through the glass. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had stepped directly into a system they never understood. All I had done was stop saving them from their own behavior. Rain fell that evening in a soft, steady curtain. I stood on the balcony with a warm mug in my hands, listening to the quiet rhythm of drops against metal. The city behind the mist felt distant, almost muted. My phone buzzed with updates, articles, and messages I didn't bother to check. The world could wait. Beside me lay a photo my father once mailed. The 3 of us on a beach, sun hitting our faces unevenly. I traced the soft edge of the picture. It felt like holding a memory that had outgrown its meaning. Some stories are lighter when you finally put them down. Work stayed steady that week. I signed contracts, contributed to discussions where my voice mattered, and walked the halls without feeling like a placeholder. Noah passed my desk with a small, knowing smile, and that was enough. In my mailbox, a letter with Grace's uneven handwriting waited. She told me she'd enrolled in a financial rebuilding program and understood if I never replied. There was no accusation, only quiet acknowledgement of what she hadn't seen before. I set her letter beside the old photograph and watched the rain slide down the glass. Later, I drove to the coast, the same stretch of sand from that picture. The tide wrapped around my ankles and released them gently. I whispered, "I forgive you," into the wind. Not for them, but for the version of myself who needed the release. Forgiveness isn't surrender, it's choosing peace over a story that never belonged to you. Some boundaries are drawn the moment you stop returning to places that taught you to shrink. My family believed I would carry their mistakes forever. But I didn't break the cycle, I simply stepped out of it. The ocean behind me moved with quiet certainty. I took one last breath of salt air and walked back to my car. The past stayed behind me, finally where it belonged.